Hi there. So I wanted to talk a little bit about Module 8. Great discussion so far. I want to bring up a few points. First, one thing I don't like about the module, I have to be honest, and these modules were created in teams, and now we all agreed to kind of see them through. But I'll have to say that I find it problematic that we have a module on learning for all. I think that we should be thinking about the content in this module in every single module, is my thinking, and that's my development as an educator. Having said that, we are in the module, so let's talk about it. First, language and math. Many people talked about the academic language that we use in math class and how it's so important to understand that math vocabulary is not part of everyday vocabulary for many, many students. And that's really important to remember. And so when we do some explanation using math vocabulary, it's really important to use student-friendly language at the same time. Marianne Small, if you've seen some clips from her throughout the course, and she speaks about things very interestingly, and she invites everybody in the conversation just by the language that she uses. So for example, she will say like, she'll give like an image of a steep line and a shallow line, and she'll ask, so what's the difference between this guy and this guy? And so it's like a very friendly type of language that students kind of want to enter into. And from the students, we gather the math language and we write it up on the wall and we talk about it and we treat it as new words, because really they are for many, many people. So we do have to support things like students speaking their native language in the classroom or using Google Translate, things like that. And we do have to understand that this language is not common for all. The next thing is the second question. Many people talked about making sure that we represent different racialized groups, and I would say lots of we represent many different groups in the mathematicians that we talked about. So do we talk about female mathematicians? Do we talk about gay, lesbian mathematicians? Do we talk about Black, Indian, South Asian? Who is it that we're talking about? Whose math are we really talking about? Common example being, we still call the Pythagorean theorem when we know as a fact that the Pythagorean theorem was used by Babylonians in India and China ages before Greece. And yet we still in our curriculum call it the Pythagorean theorem. So it's interesting. We do have to kind of shift. And really all the math that we attribute to Euclid, to the Greeks, it was all done well ahead of time. Well before them. They just formalized it in a way that we kind of decided was useful for us, but it had been thought about and it had been documented ages before by people all over the world. And so I think that it's important that we recognize that putting a picture of a mathematician on a wall is pushing an agenda. The question is, whose agenda is it pushing? I'll stop there about that, about representation, but I do think that it's very important. The next thing I want to talk about is, what do we use the math for in our class? We can use math for solving some fun problems, and we definitely should, and we should play games, and we should do puzzles, and we should have problems that are interesting. But we should also use math to shine a lens on different things that are happening in the world. This is obviously my opinion that we should be doing that. but there's a lot of writing out there about social justice mathematics, and I just think that it's important that students realize that we can use math to talk about some real issues that they probably care about. So do we look at the electoral system, and do we look at the probabilities and the percentages, and who the electoral system probably serves better than other people who are marginalized by the system? Do we talk about the fairness of the different tax brackets, and where we consider like the top tax bracket, does that even make sense in the GTA, for example? Do we look at something like the reparations that were paid out to the Indigenous people as a result of residential schooling in comparison to how horrific residential schooling actually was? So a lot of people were outraged when these reparations were paid out, but when you look at what people received versus what intergenerational trauma they had to suffer, it's interesting to talk about, because a lot of these conversations aren't had at home. Do we talk about even looking at proportionality and the funding that a residential school would receive versus a regular elementary school? And we can even look at the lack of funding or the lack of secondary schools on many reserves. So what does that look like for students that still have to leave a reserve in order to receive secondary school diplomas? Many people talked about the Indigenous oral sharing of knowledge. And so again, for this, I bring up Peter Liljedahl's work, and that I think that it really is, and that really we should infuse that Indigenous way of knowing, and we should be open about the fact that that's one of the reasons that, as a math teacher, that's one of the reasons that I appreciate Liljedahl's work, is that it does pay homage to that Indigenous way of knowing and learning. And the last thing that I wanted to talk about is something that's very near and dear to my heart right now, and it is the idea of equity in applied versus academic programming. So when we look at applied and academic programming, there's definitely an equity issue there, because many students choose applied programming only based on where they're coming from in terms of their postal code, and that there's tons of data to show that throughout the province. And then they don't do as well because we as teachers have lower expectations of applied students. But in fact, they're exactly the same students that we're getting in the class. So I think that we have to take a long, hard look at ourselves as teachers. And when we teach an applied class versus an academic class, what are the types of expectations that we have of these students? And so I think that that's something that you can probably look out for. I think TDSB is definitely working on de-streaming their grade 9 program because of equity and oppression issues. So it's something that's interesting to think about in this day and age. I'm going to leave this discussion open for comments, so if people do want to comment, that's totally fine. Otherwise, I hope that you enjoyed the learning, and we'll talk to you soon.